So you've already know about, and of course are using every single day, the built-in React hooks like use effect, use state, use context, use layout effect, and some other hooks. And you've probably noticed that these functions are all prefixed with use. Now, these are built-in hooks, and sometimes we tend to use hooks coming from third-party libraries. But what most people probably don't know is that we can create our own custom hooks. So let me scroll a little bit down here to this short description. So a custom hook is a JavaScript function whose name starts with use, and that may call other hooks. So one thing that you notice about the hooks, both built-in, third-party, and also the ones that we're going to build together, they all must start with use. Like, it's not mandatory, they will work, they're just functions, and they will work with just a simple name, but there is this naming convention so that we can distinguish between normal functions. And if we scroll a little bit further down, there's another, I think, there is this really useful Q&A section, like there are some frequently asked questions. I will share the link after our call, so you can look a little bit about this, some questions that might come up. So in this demo, we're going to be building a custom hook for fetching some information from an API. Before diving into in how we create a custom hook, I'm just going to create a very simple example. Let me zoom in the code a little bit to see how we end up using custom hooks, why we need custom hooks, and how custom hooks help us reuse some code and make our code more readable and cleaner. So before going into custom hooks, I'm just going to create a simple function, a simple component that uses that fetches some data from an API. So let's make a function, let's say users. This will be a component. And I'm going to be displaying it here inside the app component. And I want this component to be able to display a list of users coming from an API. So this users component will be fetching something from a dummy API. So of course, I will have to use the use effect because I want this side effect. This network request is considered a side effect in React. So I want to use effect to run this fetch request only once when the component has been mounted. So I'm going to say fetch. I'm going to grab this this URL, and then of course I'm going to be getting a response back. I know this response will contain a body with a JSON object, so I can convert that response body into a JSON object with the JSON method. And then I'm just going to console log for now to see that we are users. Let me also open the console. So there's an error somewhere. We're going to find that. I'm just going to clear the console. Okay, let's refresh to see what happens. Sometimes Code Sandbox needs, okay, a refresh. So as you can see, the users component has been mounted. Once the component is mounted, the use effect function gets called. We fetch the URL, we convert the body into a JSON, and then we console log the result. The reason why we see this fetch happening twice is because in React version 18, when we're in development mode, the initial mount is rendering twice, is running twice. This is happening for a reason. It won't happen in production code. But starting with React version 18, this will be always happening when you're developing. So don't worry about this. There's a reason for why the team of React made this double, let's say, render. But because I want to like disable this behavior for now, I'm going to go to the index.js, the main JS file, and I'm going to disable the strict mode. So instead of rendering the app in strict mode, I'm going to be commenting out the strict mode and thus disabling this double render during development. So if you want to get rid of this initial double rendering, which the team suggests that you keep, you can just omit or disable or comment this strict mode. Okay, so in one render, one initial mount, one fetch, and we get the objects. The next thing we do whenever we want like to, of course, display the contents is to set some kind of state. I will initialize this to an empty array because this is the kind of data I'm expecting from the API. And then once I have the data in my hands, I'm going to say set data users. Now the state has been set at this point, but I want to also catch and handle any errors that might happen in this promise chain. So always add a catch at the end of the promise chain. So that if something goes wrong, for example, if we mistype the URL, here you will see, you will handle this error and you can display maybe something to the user. So always handle any errors in promises using the catch method at the end most of the times. Okay, I'm getting the users, I'm passing them, I'm setting the state, and now I can display them. So I will say data. When there's data, of course, I'm going to map over the data, and I'm going to return a paragraph that contains one property name, let's say. As you can see here, after I have fetched the list, I can see a list of paragraphs with the 10 users that I get back from the API. I'm missing a key prop in my child list, so I can use the key that I get back from this API. So key user ID. Fortunately, luckily for me, I get a unique ID for every user directly from the API. As you can see here, every user has a unique ID. And everything looks good. Now, just to emulate a kind of like a slow response from the API, because we want to also add a loading indicator for this request, I'm going to add a pattern here, which I think is this. I can add a delay to the API, to this dummy API. So instead of getting back a response immediately, I will be adding a delay of 2 seconds or 2000 milliseconds. So I can simulate a kind of like long, slow response from the server. So if I refresh right now, you will see another thing I'm going to add here, and this is just because I'm using Code Sandbox. So Code Sandbox is caching the request that I get through this AJAX request. So any subsequent change in my code will quickly load the cached response. So I'm not actually reaching out to the API after the first request. I'm using the caching, the cached version. So in order to break this caching algorithm, I'm going to add a parameter, just a custom parameter that will add a random number at the end using the math random, so that every time I make a request, I get a unique URL. So the random number will, every time I'm going to run this code, will be a different random number. So this will prevent the Code Sandbox from caching the response. Since every time I run the request, a new URL will be happening, I won't be caching and won't be loading the previous cached response. So this part here is just for Code Sandbox environment, so that we can, let's say, disable the caching mechanism that is in place. So don't worry about this part. And now we should be seeing a loading that will take place after 2 seconds. As you saw, when I refresh, the component gets mounted, but the request comes back after 2 seconds. Okay, so this is just to emulate a slow response, and this is to break the caching mechanism of this environment. So why did I add 2 seconds of delay? Because I also want to add a loading indicator in my fetching component here. Most of the times we want to show something to the user while something is loading. So what I can do is I can have another state, which I can set as loading. And then whenever the fetching the fetching process is working, is in action, I will be setting the loading state to true, so that I know that my something is loading, and then I will set the loading state back to false once I get back the response from the server. To anyone who just joined, please open your microphone at any point if you have some question about the code that we're going over. So what I want to do is I want to set the loading state to true before or just as the fetch request is happening. So set loading to true. And then I'm going to use this loading state to display a loading indicator while the fetch request is loading. So I'm going to go here and I will say if loading, then let's say return loading. So if the state is loading, is true, then I will just return right here and display this loading. When the loading becomes false, once again, this statement will, of course, turn to false, and then I will be seeing this part of the component displayed. So with this loading, this simple loading variable, I can set the value to true or false, and then I will either return and display this loading or just the main section, which goes over the list and displays the users. You can see that the component right now is stuck in the loading state. This is because, of course, I set the loading state to true before the fetch request, but I never set the loading state back to false. So one way that we can switch back to the loading state false is to set the loading state here when we get a correct response, or of course, if we get an error. So if an error happens, so for example, if I break the URL, so I will see the loading here. And then, of course, after a while, I will see the error. So I need to set my loading state to false, not only in the successful response, but also in the case that something happens. If I don't set the loading state back to false in the cats, you will see that if I get an error, I will be just get stuck once again to the loading state. An error happened, the request ended, but the loading state is false, so I will just stay there seeing the loading. Now, instead of repeating myself and setting the loading state to false in both the then and the cats method, I can use the finally method in a promise chain. The finally method is a function that will be run in either cases. If the promise succeeds, so if I go to this, if I end up in this last then statement, the finally will run at the end of this execution. But also if the promise fails and I come up to this cats method, the finally will always conclude the promise with some custom callback. So this part will always get executed. And just to check it, you will see that if there's an error, and we get to the cuts instead of the then, we will see this message. If I fix the URL and we succeed and the fetch request succeeds, then we will also see after 2 seconds the finally. So this is a nice place to set the loading state back to false, because this finally will be executed no matter what the response from this promise is, whether successful or unsuccessful. So if I check, I'm loading. Now I'm back to the users. Let's also check with an error. An error happened, and we don't see anything, but at least I'm getting rid of the loading indicator. Okay, now another thing that we want to use, and most of the times when we're doing a fetch request, we need some kind of state in React to handle the error case. That is to display something if an error happens. So in this case, I'm not really handling the error case. I'm just console logging something, but the user will see nothing in this case. An error will happen, something will be displayed in the console, but most of my users are not using the web browser through with the console open, so they will see nothing. In this case, I want to use some state to display something in case an error happens, so the users can also see something on their screen. So for this, I'm going to add an error state. I'm going to set it to null, let's say, initially. And I'm going to say if an error happens, then I'm going to set the state to, let's say, the error message that I'm going to get. So I'm going to simulate or manually create an error. I'm just messing up with the URL here. You will see that, let me refresh. You will see that the error happens. I see something on the console, but I see nothing on the UI. So for this, I want to set the error to the error message. So now the state will be filled with this error message. And then I'm going to go here and I'm going to say if error, then return early with the error message. So in this case, let's refresh. We're going to see the loading indicator. And of course, the URL doesn't exist. So the fetch command will throw an error. It will be caught by the cuts method here. We're going to set the state, to set the error state into the error message that I got back from the error object. And immediately I will display something to the user. So this is the proper way to handle a loading session. We need to display a loading indicator to the users so that they are seeing something on their screen. They know that they will be expecting something. We want them to see an error message, maybe something more descriptive, like instead of failed to fetch, I can display something, sorry, something went wrong, or network request error, please try to reload or try again. Now, this is a very basic setup for a fetch request using React. We have the use effect, which is called once on the initial mount. This happens when we run the use effect with this empty array, which makes the use effect callback run just once after the initial mount. And then we have these three states: the data state variable that will eventually hold the data that we get back from the API, the loading state variable, which will hold a Boolean signifying whether we're still in the fetching process or the fetching process has concluded, and of course an error state, which will contain an error message or an object or something that we want to display to the UI if, of course, an error happens. One last thing I want to add, which is something very important, is that we also want to abort this fetch request if the component gets unmounted. So to give you an idea, let's say that I mount this component, this user's component. First of all, let me just turn this into a successful response after 2 seconds. Okay, and let me console log here user data fetched, just to see what happens. I can see that the fetch request was successfully completed. Now, the thing is that if I go here and I conditionally render this user's component, which internally it fetches, it connects to the API. So if I say, for example, show me this component only if the show variable is true. So I can conditionally display this component, right? And what happens if I hide this component? Like, or let's say unmount users. How is the unmounting process, or when does the unmounting process happens? When a component gets disappears, when, for example, a conditional render turns to false. So if I turn this, if I click this button, I will turn the show state from true to false. So this conditional rendering will not happen. The users will not be displayed, right? So if I click unmount users, I'm hiding the component, and this is when the component gets unmounted. So why am I showing this? Why have I added this button? To show you this strange case. So if I refresh, and I really quickly, I'm going to refresh, and then I'm really quickly going to hit the button unmount, and while the component is still fetching. So let me just clear the console. I will do it quickly. So I've just pressed the unmount users button, which means that the component got unmounted and it disappears from the DOM, right? But even though I just unmounted and hid the component, you will see that the fetch request was still happening. So this is not something that I want to happen. Like if I open up a, let's say, if you're in Netflix and you click a movie box, the client will start fetching some information about the movie. But if you very quickly decide not to watch that movie and you quickly close that movie model or this movie pop-up, you don't want this fetch request to still happening, right? Because you just decided not to watch that movie, you close the component, and then you want to stop all this fetching that goes in the background, movie data fetching and maybe some detailed information. So what I want to do is make sure that whenever a component gets unmounted, the fetch request stops or aborts. I abort the fetch request so that nothing happens. I don't want unnecessary HTTP requests happening in the background, right? So the way that we do this in JavaScript, this is not a React thing, is we use something called an abort controller. An abort controller, it's just what the name suggests. We are aborting, it's a controller that aborts an ongoing fetching operation. It stops the request. So the way that I do it is I go into the MDN and search for abort controller. So if I go to the MDN, I will find this abort controller interface, and it will give me some information about how I can use this. Now, I will grab a couple. I will go here to this fetch video example that they have. I will copy these 2 lines, and I will explain what they do. I'm going to come over here. And then I'm going to, let me move the URL because we want to see the code. Let me just move the URL out of this, just to make the code cleaner. Okay, and so the abort controller, as you can see, it's a constructor. It creates, it instantiates this abort controller class. It gives us a controller instance. And then through the controller object instance that we get back, we can get this signal property. Now, the way that I'm going to use this signal is by going into the fetch method and using the second argument. And I'm going to pass this signal. So this is an option that we can pass to the fetch method. And we can control the ongoing fetch request through this controller. So this is a signal that we can use to, at some point during the execution of our code or during our code runtime, we can abort this fetch request. The way that we do it is through calling a method called abort. So if I call this controller abort, through the controller object and through the signal that is passed to the fetch options, I will be able to abort this request. So if I refresh now, you will see that the message was never displayed here. So something happened, the user aborted the request. As you can see, by running this command, I can abort the request while it's ongoing. Now, of course, I don't want to abort the request when it just started. I want to abort the HTTP request only if this component gets unmounted. So if at some point this user's component gets unmounted, I want to run the controller.abort so that the HTTP request just gets aborted, gets canceled. The way that I can do it is by returning what is called in React a cleanup function. So when we are inside the use effect, the last thing that we can do in the use effect callback is return a function, which I'm going to name cleanup, just because this is how we call this, how describe these functions. And this is a function that will be executed when the component gets unmounted. We call it cleanup because it runs some code to clean things up when the component has just got unmounted. If there's a fetch request happening, if there's some timers running, if there's some ongoing process that we do not need this to keep happening if the component just gets removed from the DOM, we run some cleaning up in this function. We must return a function. I'm naming it here cleanup just to remind ourselves that this is the cleanup function. And I'm going to be executing the abort controller in this cleanup function. So what will go on in here is that the use effect will be executed, will execute the callback function once the component gets mounted, sorry. And then if the component gets unmounted, if I remove it from the DOM, this function will be executed. So this means that when the component gets unmounted, when I click the unmount users, this callback, this cleanup function will get executed. It will abort the HTTP request. So I will be seeing that no data will be fetched and the HTTP request will be aborted at that point. So let's test that by quickly unmounting. And as soon as the component gets mounted, I click the button gets unmounted, the cleanup function gets executed, and it stops, aborts the request. So let me add the console log to make this even clearer. Let's see. And let's add here. So this is the side effect that will run after the initial mount. So let's have some console logs. So as you can see, the component gets mounted. After the components get mounted, the side effect is running. The side effect is a callback function that we pass to the use effect. I see this console log. The component gets unmounted. The cleanup function gets executed. Here we see the component unmounted running cleanup. And this is where the abort controller gets executed, and we get this error, which is the abort error thing that we saw earlier. This is the proper way to handle a fetch request in React. We have to use a cleanup function and abort the HTTP request if that component gets unmounted.